April 30th, 1945. A gunshot echoes through the Führerbunker beneath Berlin's burning streets. But what if that trigger was never pulled? What if Adolf Hitler, architect of humanity's darkest chapter, survived to face the justice he desperately tried to escape? The man responsible for 50 million deaths, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, and the reduction of Europe to rubble would instead stand before the world, not as a dictator commanding armies, but as a prisoner answering for crimes that defied human comprehension. This alternate timeline doesn't just change one man's fate. It rewrites the entire post-war world, transforms how we remember the Holocaust, and forces us to confront whether true justice was even possible for evil on such a scale. Let's begin in that bunker on April 30th. In our reality, Soviet forces were blocks away, artillery shells shaking concrete walls as Hitler realized his 1,000-year Reich would barely last 12 years. He married Eva Braun, wrote his final testament blaming Jews for the war he started, then ended his life. But imagine instead that Braun convinces him surrender is the only option, or that senior officers physically prevent his suicide, believing they can negotiate better terms if they deliver him alive. Within hours, Soviet troops would storm that bunker and seize the most wanted man on Earth. The psychological shock of capture would be profound. Hitler spent years constructing an image of Aryan supremacy and personal invincibility, believing himself chosen by destiny. Sudden powerlessness, stripped of uniform and authority, paraded before cameras as Red Army soldiers laugh at this diminished figure, would shatter the constructed identity completely. The Soviets face an immediate dilemma. Stalin wants him in Moscow for a show trial demonstrating Soviet victory, but Britain's Churchill and America's Truman demand he face international justice. After intense negotiation, the Allies agree. Hitler will stand trial at Nuremberg alongside Göring, Hess, and other Nazi leaders, but this time the proceedings gain exponentially greater significance. The Nuremberg trials, which in our history began November 1945 and lasted nearly a year, would transform into the most watched event in human history. Hitler's presence would force the prosecution to present every horrific detail directly to the man who ordered it. Gas chamber blueprints, testimony from Auschwitz survivors, films from liberated death camps, meticulously documented evidence of Einsatzgruppen massacres across Eastern Europe. The psychological weight in that courtroom would be suffocating. Hitler's mental state during trial would likely oscillate between grandiose defiance and complete psychological collapse. Initially, he might attempt what he did throughout his rise to power: turn the courtroom into theater, deliver speeches justifying his actions as necessary for German survival, blame international Jewry and Bolshevism for forcing his hand. But the prosecution strategy would be devastating, methodically presenting evidence so overwhelming, so documented in his own words and orders, that denial becomes impossible. Witnesses would testify yards from him. Survivors would point directly at him. The human cost of his ideology, mountains of shoes, rooms of human hair, ledgers recording millions murdered, would be presented day after day after day. Psychiatrists who examined captured Nazis noted how confronting undeniable evidence broke down their psychological defenses. Rudolf Haas, Auschwitz commandant, initially showed no remorse, but eventually admitted to facilitating the murder of 2.5 million people once evidence made denial futile. Hitler would almost certainly refuse to recognize the court's legitimacy, arguing victors have no right to judge the vanquished, that he acted within German law as head of state. His lawyers might claim he was insulated from direct knowledge of extermination details, that subordinates exceeded orders, a defense other Nazis attempted. But the prosecution would counter with his own writings. Mein Kampf explicitly calls for Jewish elimination. The Wannsee Conference Protocols from January 1942 outline the final solution's administrative framework. His recorded speeches openly threaten Jewish annihilation. Hitler's own words would condemn him more effectively than any prosecutor could. The verdict would never be in doubt: guilty on all counts of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against peace. The question becomes, What sentence could possibly fit such crimes? Execution seems obvious, yet it poses problems. Making Hitler a martyr risks creating a Nazi symbol for future extremists to rally around. Some historians and Holocaust survivors in this timeline would argue death is too easy, that he deserves decades of imprisonment to truly comprehend his crime's magnitude. The Allied judges would likely sentence him to death by hanging, scheduled for Nuremberg prison like other convicted Nazi leaders. But here's where geopolitics intrudes. Stalin might demand Hitler be transferred to Soviet custody, arguing that since the USSR suffered the war's greatest casualties, 27 million dead, they deserve to determine his fate. Western allies would resist, fearing a show trial in Moscow that serves Soviet propaganda more than justice. Compromise might involve keeping him imprisoned in a jointly controlled facility while global debate rages about whether execution should proceed. And if execution is delayed or commuted to life imprisonment, where would the world's most hated man be held? No single nation would want him on their soil. The solution might mirror what happened with other high-value prisoners, a special international prison, perhaps on a remote island under four-power control, like Spandau Prison in Berlin, which held Rudolf Hess until his death in 1987. Imagine Hitler in a cell, guarded by rotating Soviet, American, British, and French soldiers, completely isolated from the outside world, forbidden visitors except lawyers and clergy, spending decades with nothing but his thoughts and the knowledge of what he caused. The psychological torture of such existence, for a man who craved adoration and power, might indeed exceed the mercy of quick execution. Every day he would wake knowing the Reich fell. Germany was divided, his grand vision failed completely, and his name became history's ultimate synonym for evil. But Hitler's survival creates ripples extending far beyond one man's punishment. The most profound impact would be on Holocaust remembrance and education. In our timeline, Hitler's suicide allowed him to become an almost mythological figure of evil, a monster whose death closed the book on Nazi Germany. With Hitler alive and testifying, the Holocaust becomes undeniably real and immediate in ways that shape collective memory differently. Survivors wouldn't be telling stories about a dead dictator's crimes, but confronting the actual man responsible, making their testimony more visceral and legally binding. This would significantly impact Holocaust denial. Conspiracy theorists who claim the genocide was exaggerated or fabricated would face the reality that the perpetrator himself was questioned, evidence was presented in his presence, and he lived to see the historical record established beyond dispute. His existence as a living witness to his own crimes would make denial psychologically harder to maintain. The trial's length would also matter enormously. While Nuremberg lasted 11 months in our history, Hitler's trial might extend years as prosecutors present evidence from every occupied territory, every death camp, every massacre site across Europe. This extended proceeding would keep Nazi atrocities in daily headlines throughout the late 1940s, preventing the relatively quick transition to Cold War concerns that occurred historically. Public consciousness would remain focused on fascism's dangers longer, potentially influencing how quickly former Nazis were rehabilitated and reintegrated into German society. In our timeline, by the early 1950s, West Germany was rearming and employing former Nazi officials because Cold War pragmatism outweighed denazification goals. With Hitler's trial still proceeding or recently concluded, political pressure to maintain distance from Nazi collaborators would be much stronger, possibly resulting in more thorough denazification processes. Germany's psychological recovery would follow a different path as well. German citizens in the immediate post-war years engaged in what historians call collective denial, claiming they didn't know about death camps, that they were just following orders, that Hitler deceived them. This allowed psychological distance from guilt. But with Hitler alive and testifying, Germans couldn't maintain that same separation. His presence would force a national reckoning more immediate and uncomfortable than what occurred historically. Survivors and witnesses pointing at Hitler in court, describing what happened, would make German complicity harder to rationalize. This might accelerate the generational shift where younger Germans confronted their parents' generation about their roles during the Nazi period, a process that in our timeline didn't fully emerge until the 1960s and 70s. The impact on international law would be equally significant. The Nuremberg trials established precedents for prosecuting crimes against humanity and aggressive war, directly leading to the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and eventually the International Criminal Court. Hitler's trial would amplify this legal revolution. His defense arguments that he acted as a sovereign leader, that victors have no jurisdiction over the vanquished, that state actions can't be crimes, would be definitively rejected with the world watching. This would strengthen international law's authority and establish more clearly that national sovereignty doesn't protect leaders who commit genocide. Future dictators like Slobodan Milosevic, Charles Taylor, and others prosecuted by international tribunals would face legal frameworks reinforced by Hitler's conviction. The argument that heads of state enjoy immunity for any action would be demolished more thoroughly than in our timeline. Consider also how Hitler's survival affects Nazi ideology's legacy. In our history, Hitler's suicide was interpreted by some neo-Nazis as a heroic last stand, a leader who died for his beliefs rather than surrender. This mythology feeds into fascist glorification. A captured, imprisoned, or executed Hitler destroys that narrative completely. He becomes not a martyr, but a defeated criminal, his final years spent powerless and humiliated, his ideology proven catastrophically wrong by outcome. This might not eliminate neo-Nazism. Extremism rarely depends on rational assessment, but it removes a martyrdom narrative that holds psychological appeal for some adherents. Instead of dying mysteriously in a bunker, his fate is documented, public, and utterly unheroic. There's another dimension worth considering: the personal testimonies that might emerge. In our timeline, we have extensive documentation of Nazi crimes, but not Hitler's own words accounting for them beyond propaganda and orders. With Hitler alive and interrogated extensively, we might have direct testimony about decision-making processes that led to specific atrocities. When did he decide on systematic extermination rather than forced deportation? What was his personal involvement in death camp design? How did he rationalize these decisions psychologically? These insights would be historically invaluable, providing primary source material that helps future generations understand how ordinary political processes can devolve into genocide. His testimony would become required study in schools worldwide, a permanent record of how charismatic leadership combined with ethnic hatred and unchecked power produces atrocity. Finally, we must address the uncomfortable question: would this alternate outcome actually serve justice better? Justice has multiple purposes: punishment, deterrence, restoration, truth-telling. Hitler's execution after a fair trial achieves punishment and establishes truth through the legal record. But does it provide the deterrence and restorative justice that victims deserve? Some Holocaust survivors who testified at Nuremberg found the process healing, finally having their suffering acknowledged in official legal proceedings. Others found it re-traumatizing. If Hitler lived, survivors would face the ongoing reality of their tormentors' continued existence, which some would find intolerable and others would prefer, wanting him to suffer awareness of his failure. There's no universally satisfying answer. Perhaps the truest justice would be what actually happened. Hitler denied the opportunity to justify himself, his ideology utterly defeated, and the world moving forward to ensure such evil never repeats. Yet his survival would have undeniably changed how we remember, teach, and legally respond to genocide in ways that might have strengthened our collective commitment to never again. This thought experiment reveals that sometimes the most important historical questions have no single right answer, only different consequences